Okay, in this video, we're going to look at how to pick at your opponent's use of quotes. So if they have a quote, how to defeat that quote. Now, a note before we begin, you don't always need to do this. In fact, quotes usually aren't very important. So usually you don't even need to bother doing this unless the quote is central. And the reason for this is usually quotes are just used to introduce the idea or introduce the argument, but the actual argument comes later, and it's not so much of a quote as it is an example or something. So you don't always need to attack the quotes. Only bother if the quote is central to the argument or it's the main evidence that the opponent is using to support their point. Anyway, though, if you do want to defeat quotes, there are a few things you can say. First, you can say the quote is not from a credible source. All right, a quote needs to come from an expert on the subject. If you're debating about free trade versus fair trade, the quote should come from an expert in trade. If the person who's said the quote isn't an expert in trade, then how does he know that what he's saying is true? How does he know anything about trade? There's no reason to believe this person. If you're getting like a quote from a doctor who's talking about trade, that doesn't really make much sense because doctors don't know about trade. They don't know about the economy as much, unless he's a doctor who also happens to be an expert on trade. Also, people who are not very significant. Your dad, even though your dad is usually a reliable source in debate rounds, he's not really a credible source to use because the judge doesn't know who your dad is and what his credentials are. Your little brother is not a credible source. You are not a credible source. Please don't quote yourself. Don't quote your best friend. You need to quote an expert in the subject. And so this is one way you can attack your opponent's use of quotes. If they're not quoting someone who has a credible source, point that out. The quote is destroyed. Second way, the quote is taken out of context. The quote's taken out of context. So this unfortunately does happen sometimes, even though it's completely against the rules. Your opponent will take the quote, whether intentionally or misintentionally, and he'll twist it to say something that the original person who said it didn't mean. So he cut out some words here and there, some key words. So maybe in saying free trade is not good, he cut out the word not and said free trade is good. Or even if he didn't tamper directly with the quote, maybe it's just taken out of context, right? And he just took only a small segment that said what he wanted, but if you listen to the whole quote, actually the person who was saying the quote was saying something completely different, and the quote was taken out of context. So we'll watch out for quotes that are taken out of context. Point that out because that's that's a very foul play by your opponent, and that quote can be also destroyed. Third thing, the quote doesn't relate to the main issues here. The quote has to relate to what you're talking about. If the quote doesn't relate to what you're talking about, if it doesn't relate to the debate or the values or your side, it has nothing to do with anything. And this actually happens a lot, at least in my region. People will introduce their cases with a quote, and the quote sounds great. Only problem is it has nothing to do with their case. And so the quote doesn't really mean or say anything. Usually what I do in these instances is I just ignore the quote. I mean, if it's not doing anything anyway, then no need to do anything because it's not doing anything anyway. If you want, though, you can say that doesn't relate to the main issues here, and you can kind of toss it out. So that's how to address your quotes. And so before I end this video, I just want to go over a couple overall tips. And we went over these, but they're really important. So overall tip number one for anything, try to turn your opponent's arguments around. You can say, my opponent's argument that blah, blah, blah is a great one. In fact, it supports my case even better than his own. If your opponent makes an argument that you can twist around to make it support your side, do it, because that's very, very effective. Your opponent's argument for his side, maybe for his value, actually supports your side or your value or something like that. You can twist your opponent's arguments around. You can also argue your opponent's arguments have no significance to his case. So your opponent makes this random argument. So what? That doesn't support his position. That doesn't support his value. That I don't know why he's talking about that. You say, there's no impact, Judge. There's no impact. And we're going to talk more about impacts in the next video. We already talked about it a little in case writing. You remember you need a claim, warrant, and an impact. All right. The last thing, vagueness. Just look for general vagueness. Vagueness in their case. Maybe they're talking a lot about justice and how justice is good and this, but they're not really explaining anything, and they're just vaguely talking about something just to make themselves sound good maybe, and it's vague and it doesn't really make much sense. You can point out, Judge, this is vague. And at the end of the day, there's just the two things I really want you to remember. Watch out for whether your opponent's arguments don't support his side or don't support his value. If they don't support his value or they don't support his side, that's a very, very big deal. If your opponent can't prove that his value is the highest value, big deal. If your opponent can't prove that his side upholds his value, very big deal. Because if either of those two things are missing, nothing else even matters in his case. Everything falls apart. Nothing else even matters. So that's it for strategies for attacking your opponent's case. In the next video, we're going to look at how to sort of make the arguments when you're making the argument, sort of a format you can use when you're actually up at the podium and speaking. We're going to look at identify, claim, warrant, impact in the next video.